Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The Alpine Meadow. I've done botanical survey work for a conservation nonprofit for 8 years, spending every field season hiking remote terrain in the Sierra Nevada cataloging rare plant populations, specifically in high alpine meadows that are often accessible only by long approach hikes through roadless wilderness. The work requires precise location recording, careful physical assessment of individual plants, and long stretches of slow, methodical movement across terrain where the main thing you hear is wind and the main thing you see is the view. High alpine meadows are unusual places to work. They tend to be bowls or benches just below ridge lines, often completely exposed, with a view from one end to the other across terrain that offers almost no cover to anything moving through. If something is in a meadow with you, you know it's there. You can see the whole space. This was 3 seasons ago, a survey in a remote meadow complex at roughly 12,000 feet in the southern Sierra, accessed by a 9-mile approach that effectively ensured I'd be alone. I was on my 4th day of a 5-day solo survey, working the upper end of the main meadow, when I became aware that the 2 alpine marmots that had been active on the rocky slope at the meadow's edge for most of the morning had gone quiet and underground, in the specific way marmots respond to a predator threat, which is sudden, complete, and audible if you know to listen for it. I looked around the meadow carefully. Nothing was visible across the whole open expanse, which at 12,000 feet in clear September light is truly open. No tall vegetation, no boulders big enough to conceal anything, just short alpine grass and the occasional patch of sedge. I finished the quadrant I was working on and moved to the next, and about 20 minutes later the marmots had not re-emerged, which is considerably longer than they typically stay underground for a passing ground predator, which usually gets about 5 or 10 minutes of their attention before they risk surfacing again. Something was still keeping them down. I looked around again, and this time, at the far end of the meadow where the terrain dropped away toward a lower drainage, I saw a dark shape at the tree-lean edge, at the limit of comfortable identification distance without optics, maybe 400 meters. I stopped what I was doing and raised my binoculars. At that distance, my binoculars should have resolved it clearly. They're quality optics, 8 power, and I use them constantly in this work to identify plants and animals at range. What I saw in the glass was a large, dark form that was upright, and that was standing still in the way that upright things stand still differently from the way 4-legged things stand still. 4-legged animals at rest at a tree lean tend to have a low center of gravity and a visible horizontal mass. This had a vertical center of gravity and a vertical orientation, tall relative to its width, and it held that orientation with a steadiness that suggested habitual balance rather than temporary balance. I've spent 8 seasons working in terrain that has all the large mammals common to the Sierra. I've watched black bears work meadow edges many times. This didn't have the posture, the shape, or the profile of a bear, including a bear standing on its hind legs, which I've also seen and which produces a recognizable, top-heavy profile that wasn't what I was looking at. It was too tall, too narrow, and held a posture that suggested something habitually upright rather than something temporarily upright. After several minutes, it was no longer there. Not gone in any way I could track, just no longer present at the tree lean in the way it had been. I finished my day's survey, made camp, and the next morning hiked out a day early, which I've never done on a solo survey before or since. I described what I'd seen to my field coordinator when I returned, someone with decades of Sierra Nevada botanical and wildlife field experience, not as a report requiring action, but as something I wanted to document. She listened carefully, asked whether the marmot behavior had preceded or followed the sighting, and when I confirmed it had preceded it, she nodded in a way that suggested the detail was meaningful to her rather than surprising. She told me she'd received one other account from a field surveyor working a different meadow complex in the same general wilderness area 3 seasons before my own, involving a similar observation of an upright, dark figure at a meadow edge that couldn't be resolved as any known species. She'd never known what to do with that account either. We filed both accounts in the project's informal notes, attached to the coordinates, the kind of documentation that doesn't fit any formal data field, but that feels worth preserving anyway. I still survey in that wilderness area every season. I've been back to that meadow complex twice. The marmots are always there, working the rocky edges, going about their business. On both return visits, they stayed active the entire time I was present. Whatever they responded to 3 seasons ago hasn't appeared to them again in my presence, and they're the most reliable early warning system that meadow has. When they go underground, something is out there. What I want to emphasize about the marmots, because it's the detail I keep returning to, is how reliable they are as a threat detection system. Alpine marmots have survived in Sierra Nevada terrain long enough to have sharp, well-calibrated threat responses. When they go underground silently and stay down, something in their environment is triggering a real alarm, not a false one. They make a very specific, audible warning call when they spot an aerial predator and a different sound for ground predators and go silent for immediate threats. They went silent. Then they stayed underground for close to 20 minutes, which is considerably longer than their normal predator avoidance duration for passing mountain lions or coyotes, both of which I've seen trigger shorter response windows. I'm not arguing that the marmots prove anything about what I saw across that meadow. I'm saying that 2 separate sensory systems, mine and theirs, were responding to something in that meadow at approximately the same time. My system gave me an inconclusive visual at 400 meters. Their system gave them a sustained, serious threat response that lasted 20 minutes. The combination of those 2 data points is harder to dismiss than either one alone. The field coordinator's account of a prior survey, 3 seasons before mine, adds a 3rd data point. 3 separate observations, in the same wilderness complex, across different seasons, by different observers, an upright dark figure at a meadow edge, not resolved to any known species. I don't know what to do with that as data, but I also can't ignore it. It's what the evidence shows. The hiked-out-a-day-early decision is something I've thought about often since, because it's not in character for me professionally. I'm systematic. I finish what I plan to finish. I don't cut surveys short based on discomfort or unease. I've worked through lightning events on exposed ridgelines and stayed in the field through conditions worse than that afternoon by any objective measure. What made me pack up and hike out was something different, closer to a considered assessment than a panicked response. The sense that whatever was at the meadow's edge had been observing me for a reason I didn't understand, and that I would rather not test further. I've tried to be honest with myself about whether that decision was the right one and whether it reflected something real or something imagined, and I've concluded that I don't need to resolve that question to respect the decision I made at the time. A field researcher working alone in remote terrain at 12,000 feet, 8 miles from the nearest road, has good reason to take any sustained unease seriously, and I acted on mine. Whether the figure I saw was something mundane I misidentified at range, or something I correctly identified and correctly chose to put distance between myself and the outcome of the decision is the same. I completed enough of the survey to be professionally useful. I got myself back to a road before dark, and I'm still here doing this work 3 seasons later. That's not nothing. The field coordinator who heard my account has since retired, which means the informal documentation we made together lives in files that may or may not survive the project's archiving in any accessible form. That impermanence bothers me more than it probably should. Two separate observations, in the same wilderness area, years apart, made by people whose professional training specifically calibrates careful, precise field observation. That's not nothing. That's the kind of data point that deserves to persist somewhere more durable than informal project notes. I've thought about what it would take to formally document and compare those two accounts in a way that would hold up to scrutiny, and what I keep running into is the fact that there's no institutional category for this kind of observation, no field in any survey form where you record what you couldn't identify rather than what you did, no process for systematically collecting the experiences that fall outside the known fauna. The absence of a category isn't the same as the absence of an observation. The Ice Fisherman. I've ice fished since I was old enough to hold a rod, mostly on remote lakes in northern Minnesota, the kind of lakes that don't have plowed access roads, and where you hike or snowshoe in hauling your gear, setting up a portable shelter in the middle of open ice that might be a mile from the nearest shoreline in any direction. When you're that far out on a frozen lake in January, you can see for a considerable distance in every direction, and any movement anywhere on the ice is immediately visible. That's relevant to what I'm going to describe. This was 3 winters ago, a lake I've fished many times, a 6-mile round-trip snowshoe in through a state forest, a lake that I've never seen another angler on in close to 30 trips across a decade. I was set up roughly in the center, just before noon, the sky overcast and flat, visibility excellent across the entire lake surface. I became aware of something at the far shoreline on the north end of the lake, maybe half a mile away. It was moving across the ice, coming from the tree line toward the open water, and it was walking upright. My first instinct was another angler, which would have been unusual but not impossible. I watched it for several minutes as it moved away from the shoreline. It wasn't moving the way a person moves with gear. No bobbing from a pack, no asymmetry from a dragged sled, just a straight, even upright walk across the flat ice. At roughly a quarter mile, I became increasingly convinced it was not a person. The proportions were wrong in a way that became more obvious the closer it got, not the kind of distortion that distance produces and that resolves when something approaches, but the opposite. The wrongness became clearer as the scale reference improved, the arms too long, the height too considerable, even accounting for the way the flat white surface can make distant objects appear taller than they are. It got to within about 200 yards of my position before stopping, at which point I had it framed clearly in my binoculars at a range where I've positively identified individual people on ice surfaces many times before in comparable light conditions. It stood there for what I estimate was close to 3 minutes, and I was watching it the entire time. I could not make out a face or fine detail at that distance. What I could determine with confidence was that it was substantially taller than any person I've encountered in the field. I estimate close to 8 feet based on visual comparison to my own shelter, which is a known height, and which it was somewhat taller than from my angle, that its arms appeared proportionally longer than a person's arms appear at that distance in that reference context, and that it was absolutely still during those 3 minutes in a way that people standing on open ice in sub-zero temperatures simply aren't. People standing still in the cold shift weight between feet, adjust collars, bring their hands to their faces. This did nothing. It was as still as a marker post, which is exactly the comparison my brain kept offering me, even as I knew it wasn't a marker post. It turned and walked back toward the north shoreline. I watched it the entire way. It reached the tree line and was gone. I packed up my gear and left, which is something I've almost never done voluntarily mid-session in 30 years of ice fishing. I sat in my truck at the trailhead for a while before driving home, trying to construct a full-length explanation for what I'd seen, and I couldn't. I know what a person looks like at 200 yards on open ice. I know what a moose looks like at 200 yards. I know what happens to proportions and movement at that distance under the specific lighting conditions of an overcast January day on a white surface. None of those reference points fit what I watched for the better part of 10 minutes that afternoon. I haven't told many people this story because I know exactly how it sounds, and I have no interest in defending it. I'm telling it here because I've since found one other account from a different ice fisherman on a lake in the same general region of that state forest, describing a similar observation from a similar distance with similar proportions, posted to a fishing forum in a thread about strange things seen on remote lakes. He concluded his account the same way I'm concluding mine. No explanation, no theory he was willing to defend, no desire to go back to that particular lake. I haven't been back to that lake either. I have 29 other trips there across a decade, and nothing about the lake has ever been anything other than what it appeared to be. One afternoon changed that. Whatever I watched walk out of the trees, stand on the ice 200 yards away watching me, and walk back into the trees, I don't have a name for. And the absence of a name is the thing I find hardest to carry. 3 winters later, sitting in my truck before any early season ice trip, looking at the route on a map and feeling something I don't have a precise name for either. Not quite fear, not quite dread. Something closer to the specific unease of knowing a place is different now than it used to be and not being able to undo that knowledge. I want to add some detail about the specific observing conditions because they matter for how confident I am in what I'm describing. I fish remote lakes specifically because of the visibility they offer. There are no trees, no terrain features, no cover of any kind on the open ice surface. Whatever you see out there, you see in full, in context, against a known reference background of flat white that extends the same distance in every direction. The light that day was even and flat, no harsh shadows or glare effects from a low winter sun, the kind of diffuse cloud cover that actually improves visibility for this kind of observation rather than complicating it. The binoculars I use are quality optics that I've used for years and trust completely. I was not cold enough to be cognitively impaired. I was not tired. I had been awake for several hours and had eaten breakfast before the hike in. I describe these conditions not to preempt skepticism, but because I ran through them myself, methodically, sitting in that truck at the trailhead afterward. I was trying to find the flaw in my own observation, the specific factor that would let me write off what I'd seen as a perceptual error rather than an accurate record of something I don't have an explanation for. I didn't find one. What I saw was large, upright, proportionally wrong, and behaviorally wrong, for over 10 minutes of continuous observation at distances ranging from half a mile to 200 yards. That's not a glance. That's not a shape glimpsed briefly in ambiguous light. That's a sustained observation under good conditions by a careful, experienced observer who's spent decades on open ice and knows exactly how things look out there. The difference between that and anything I'd ever seen before was not subtle. 3 winters later, I want to be clear about one thing. I don't think what I saw was a costume, a prank, or a person with an unusual medical condition. I've considered all of those in the time since. The lake is 6 miles round trip by snowshoe from the nearest parking area. There was one other vehicle at the trailhead when I left, a truck that had been there since before I arrived, and that belonged, based on the registration visible through the window, to a local address I later recognized as a property owner with a cabin on a different arm of the lake entirely. Nobody hiked or snowshoed out past me on my way back. Whatever was on that ice with me that afternoon had gotten there by some means I can't account for and left by some means I can't account for, and spent the minutes in between standing 200 yards away looking at me, which is itself the detail that belongs least to any mundane explanation I can assemble. I used to look forward to that lake more than almost any other destination in my ice fishing rotation. Reliable panfish population, excellent solitude, terrain that rewards the long hike in with the kind of fishing that more accessible lakes can't match. I haven't been back in 3 winters. I don't know if I will. The lake is still there. The fish are still there. Whatever I watched walk back into the trees that afternoon is still, as far as I know, somewhere on that shoreline. That last part is the only part one finds genuinely hard to think about. The mail route. I've driven a rural mail route in the hill country of eastern Tennessee for going on 14 years, a loop that covers about 60 miles of back roads, some of them paved, some of them gravel, running through a part of the county that doesn't get a lot of through traffic, and where the houses are spread far enough apart that you can go a full mile between stops. Most days, I'm the only vehicle on certain stretches of that route for the better part of the morning, and there are long straight sections of empty road where I know exactly what I should be seeing before I get there. There's a section of my route that runs along the bottom of a narrow, wooded hollow, maybe 2 miles of gravel road with steep, forested slopes on both sides, one of the oldest parts of the county in terms of settlement history, with home place names that show up on surveys going back to the early 1800s and a cemetery up a side track that I pass twice a week, without ever having seen anyone visiting it in 14 years of driving the route. The road follows a creek that runs cold year-round, and the whole hollow has the particular quality that some very old rural places have, a sense of density, like more has happened there than you can actually account for by looking at it, something I'd noticed for years before anything unusual happened to me there, and that I'd always attributed to nothing more than the particular way that deep, shaded hollows in old hardwood country feel closed in and self-contained in a way that more open landscapes don't. This was about 4 years ago, a Tuesday in late October, close to the end of my route. I came around the bend at the top of the hollow and saw a person standing at the side of the road, maybe 300 yards ahead, on the gravel shoulder near the creek bank. This was not one of my regular stops. There was no mailbox there, and it was unusual enough to see someone standing still on that stretch at all that I noticed it immediately. As I got closer, maybe 150 yards out, I became aware that something about the figure was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. It was facing away from me, which was the first thing, since most people who hear a mail truck coming look up. It was also tall, or seemed tall relative to the trees and the bank behind it in a way that I registered without consciously calculating. And it was standing in a way that seemed extraordinarily still, not the relaxed stillness of someone waiting, but a more total absence of movement than a person actually achieves just standing there. At roughly 100 yards, it was simply gone. Not gone as in it stepped behind something, or walked away, or turned and moved off the shoulder into the trees. Gone as in it was there, and then my truck covered another 20 or 30 feet of ground, and it wasn't there, with no cover anywhere near that spot adequate to conceal a person in the time available. The creek bank was open, the gravel shoulder was open, the road itself had no curve or dip to hide anything that had been clearly visible moments before. I've replayed that moment more times than I can count, and the sequence is always the same. Present, my truck moves, absent, with nothing in between that explains the transition. I pulled over where it had been standing and got out. The gravel shoulder was soft enough in places from recent rain that I should have seen footprints, even a partial impression from a single step onto the softer ground. There weren't any, not in the immediate area where it had appeared to be standing, and not in the several feet of shoulder on either side of that point. The creek bank on the other side was soft mud, absolutely clean, showing nothing but the narrow, three-toed prints of a great egret that had clearly been working the shallow water some time earlier. I stood there for several minutes trying to understand what I was looking at, and came up with nothing. I mentioned it to an older carrier who'd driven parts of that same route for years before me, the closest thing our office has to an institutional memory for that particular stretch of county. Without my specifying where it had happened, she asked whether it was in the hollow. When I confirmed it was, she said she'd had 2 experiences on that stretch herself over the years, both involving figures at the roadside that weren't there when she reached the spot, and that she'd heard the same account from at least one carrier who'd worked the route before either of us. She said it the way she'd say anything practical about the route, matter-of-factly, in the tone of someone passing along useful information about a tricky intersection or a dog that runs at the truck, not particularly dramatic and not particularly troubled by it. She'd been driving that hollow for years before the first one happened, she said, and she'd driven it for years after. The practical thing, she suggested, was simply to know about it and not let it rattle you when it happened. I've driven that stretch close to 3,000 times since. Whatever I saw that October morning has shown up once more, in a different spot in the same hollow, about 2 years later, with the same quality of wrongness and the same immediate, inexplicable absence when I reached where it had been. I didn't stop that second time. I noted the location, drove on, finished my route, and filed it away with the same practical acceptance that 14 years of driving isolated roads in all weather and all hours eventually produces. Some things are part of the route. You learn them the same way you learn everything else about the road. I want to be specific about what I mean when I say it was simply gone. In 14 years of driving that route, I've had deer jump off embankments and vanish into brush. I've seen animals I couldn't identify disappear around curves or into tall grass. I understand how quickly a living thing can leave a visible field, and I've calibrated that understanding against hundreds of actual observations. What I saw that Tuesday was different. The physics of it were wrong. The cover wasn't there. The time wasn't enough. I've driven back to that spot at approximately the same time of day since, parked in roughly the same position, walked the shoulder and the creek bank with no particular urgency, and confirmed every time that there is nowhere for a person-sized object to have gone between being visible at 100 yards and invisible at 70, in the fraction of a second represented by my truck moving that distance at mail route speed. I've also thought about what it means that this isn't singular to me or to one other carrier, but appears to have a history on that specific hollow that predates both of us. A single sighting is easy to chalk up to an individual failure of perception. A pattern across multiple drivers, across different years, in the same general stretch of road, with no contact between the observers beforehand, is something else. It doesn't require a dramatic explanation. It just requires an honest acknowledgement that something is happening on that road that I don't have a complete account for. What the older carrier said has stayed with me, specifically the tone of it. She wasn't frightened, and she wasn't dismissive. She was simply informative, the way an experienced person is informative about any feature of a route they know well. I've tried to carry it the same way since, with the same practical steadiness she modeled for me without necessarily intending to, treating the hollow's particular quality as simply one more thing to know about the road you drive, the way you know which corners flood in heavy rain and which gates swing shut behind you if you don't block them open. There's a quality to the practical knowledge that experienced route carriers develop about their roads that doesn't get discussed much. After enough years, you have an internal map of your route that's almost proprioceptive. You know the rhythm of it, what's coming before you can see it, how the road sounds under your tires at different speeds. That knowledge makes anomalies register fast. What I saw in that hollow both times didn't fit the internal map I'd built over a decade of driving those 2 miles. It was wrong in the way that something fundamentally out of category is wrong, not a surprise within the known range of things that can be on a rural road in eastern Tennessee, but something outside the categories entirely. My brain didn't reach for an explanation the way it does when something is surprising but categorizable. It just registered, this does not go here. That quality of the wrongness, more than any specific visual detail, is what made the experience stick. The pipeline walk. I've worked as a pipeline integrity inspector for almost 12 years, covering sections of natural gas transmission line in the Appalachian region of West Virginia and Kentucky, doing foot patrol of right-of-way strips that run through terrain ranging from accessible farmland to genuinely remote mountain hollows, where the pipeline corridor is the only cleared ground for miles. Foot patrol means walking a specific strip of land, checking for leaks, erosion, encroachment, a day's work that covers up to 15 miles of corridor, depending on terrain, almost entirely alone. Remote right-of-way inspection is its own category of solitude. The corridor through a steep mountain hollow gives you a narrow strip of managed grass and bare soil between walls of dense hardwood, a straight line driven through terrain that would otherwise be nearly impassable, maintained by periodic mowing to keep vegetation from establishing over the buried line. You see the sky above you, a band of it, and dense forest on both sides running right up to the corridor edge, and you walk for hours, aware of being the only thing moving on that particular strip of ground, the trees close enough on both sides that anything in the first several yards of the tree line is clearly visible, and anything moving in those trees catches your eye whether you intend to look or not. This was 4 years ago, a section in a remote hollow in southern West Virginia, terrain that required a 20-minute drive down a gated forest road followed by a 2-mile walk-in from a locked access gate. I was working the corridor on a clear September afternoon, heading north through a section that ran along the bottom of a hollow before climbing the far ridge, when I noticed something moving along the left tree line, keeping pace with me. I'm going to be careful about how I describe this because I need to be accurate rather than dramatic. What I saw was movement in the trees, roughly 10 to 15 yards inside the tree line, keeping a consistent lateral distance from my position and matching my walking pace. I could see enough to know it was large and upright, and moving with a deliberateness that didn't match any wildlife movement I've observed in 12 years of working forested corridors. It didn't dodge or weave through the trees the way a deer does. It moved steadily parallel, the way you would if you were watching someone walk and chose to walk alongside them, just inside cover. I stopped walking. It stopped. I started again. It started again, maintaining the same pace and distance. This continued for close to 5 minutes of walking before the tree line curved away from the corridor as the ridge began to rise, and I lost sight of the movement. I finished my section of corridor, filed my regular inspection report, and drove home. I didn't include the observation in my professional documentation because I had no way to describe it within the framework of pipeline integrity reporting. I thought about it for a long time. About 8 months later, I was comparing notes with another inspector who covers a different section of the same system further north, a guy I've known professionally for most of my career and trust completely, someone who does the same kind of careful, systematic observation work I do, and who has the same kind of calibrated, honest relationship with what he knows versus what he's speculating. He mentioned, in the context of an unrelated conversation about wildlife he'd seen on the right-of-way that week, that he'd had an experience he didn't quite know how to categorize on a remote section of his own corridor, involving something following him along the tree line for an extended period. He hadn't stopped to observe it carefully the way I had. He'd picked up his pace and finished his section faster than planned and left, the way a sensible person responds to something that makes the animal part of your brain decide it's time to be somewhere else. I asked him to describe the movement. He said steady, deliberate, pace to match him. I asked whether it had stopped when he stopped. He'd stopped once, he said, to adjust his equipment, and he went quiet for a moment and said yes, and that he hadn't tested it a second time and hadn't intended to. I told him my own story then, the same hollow, 8 months before, working from the south end of that section while he'd been working a section further along the same system in a different mountain hollow entirely. We didn't land on a conclusion. We still haven't, several years later. We check in occasionally about whether either of us has experienced anything similar since, the way colleagues do with any ongoing, unresolved professional puzzle. So far, neither of us has, which I find neither comforting nor alarming, simply a feature of the data we have, which remains stubbornly incomplete. I want to describe that 5 minutes more carefully because the experience of it is difficult to convey without the detail. I walked at a normal, deliberate pace, the pace I use when I'm actively working a section and checking for surface signs of issues, slower than a hike, faster than a stroll, consistent. Whatever was in the trees matched that pace immediately, not gradually, which means it was already moving before I was consciously tracking it, or it responded to my movement faster than I would have expected any animal to respond to a stimulus it hadn't been anticipating. When I stopped, the movement stopped in a time frame that felt simultaneous rather than delayed, which is also not how wildlife typically responds. There's usually a beat of continued momentum before a startled or cautious animal adjusts. The stop-start test, which I did twice deliberately after the first stop revealed the pattern, produced the same result both times. I started walking, it started. I stopped, it stopped. I don't know what to do with that as a data point except note it as accurately as I can. It is the detail that most resists any conventional wildlife explanation I've tried to apply, since the animals I've observed most closely in 12 years of corridor work, deer, black bear, wild turkey, coyote, all have a characteristic response latency and a characteristic continuation of motion when startled that this simply didn't exhibit. The other inspector's account, gathered 8 months later without any prompting from me toward any specific detail, described the same essential behavior: pacing, consistent distance, matching movement, from a different section of the same general system, in a different hollow, in the same general mountain region. 2 people, 2 locations. The same pattern. I've been a careful observer of natural systems for my entire working life, and careful observers of natural systems take patterns seriously. I want to add something about what that corridor feels like on the days when nothing unusual happens, which is most days, because context matters. The remote right-of-way sections I walk regularly are genuinely good places to work. The terrain is interesting, the solitude is productive, the physical demands are satisfying in the way outdoor work always is. I've had hundreds of unremarkable days in that same hollow and the surrounding corridors, and the unremarkable days vastly outnumber the ones that leave me with something I can't account for. I don't go into that work carrying an expectation of strangeness. When strangeness shows up, it shows up against a background of a long, established ordinary, and that contrast is part of what makes it impossible to dismiss. The other inspector and I still work the same general system. We still compare notes when we run into each other, still mention the experience occasionally, still check whether anything similar has come up for either of us. Nothing has, in the years since. The hollow is the same hollow. The tree line runs alongside the corridor the same way it always has. Most days I walk it without looking at the trees any more carefully than the job requires. Some days, I notice myself checking. I don't fully know what I'm looking for, beyond the thing I saw once, keeping pace in the trees, that stopped when I stopped and waited when I waited, and that I've never found a name for. I've had time to think about what the stop-start response implies, if it was what it appeared to be. An animal matching your pace and cover, and then freezing when you freeze is a specific, recognized predatory behavior, stalking. But nothing about the interaction that day felt like a predation attempt. There was no narrowing of the distance, no attempt to close ground when I was moving and most occupied with what was ahead of me, no moment of ambush when the terrain offered one. If it was predatory stalking, it was the most patient and restrained version of it I can imagine, sustained for close to 5 minutes without any apparent progression toward an outcome. That inconsistency between the behavior pattern and the apparent intention is something I've never been able to resolve, and it's part of why I've never been able to file this experience neatly under any single explanation. The River Guide. I've guided whitewater rafting trips for 11 years, mostly on rivers in the Colorado Plateau, the Green, the San Juan, the Dolores, multi-day wilderness trips where you're on the water all day and camp on sandbars at night, in canyon country so remote that the nearest road might be 4 days of paddling in either direction. I've guided hundreds of trips, camped on dozens of different beaches, and develop the kind of deep familiarity with canyon river country that only comes from spending a significant portion of your life inside it. This was 5 years ago, a private trip I was guiding for a group of 8, a 6-day trip down a stretch of the Green River through a canyon section that sees relatively light traffic, maybe 2 or 3 commercial trips per week during peak season, less outside of it. We were 4 days in when we camped on a wide sandbar below a particularly spectacular set of canyon walls, the kind of site that looks carved rather than eroded, sheer red rock rising several hundred feet on both sides, the river making a long bend around the bar that gave us clear visibility upstream and downstream for a good quarter-mile in each direction. I've camped on that bar before and since. It's an unremarkable site in every practical sense. Good flat ground, reliable firewood from driftwood, easy river access, the kind of wide, stable beach that experienced river runners instinctively favor when the light starts going and you need to make a call on where you're spending the night. Nothing about it has ever felt strange to me on any other trip, which is part of why that particular night stands out rather than blending into the general texture of years of canyon camping. That night, sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke to what I initially took for one of my guests moving around camp. Slow footsteps in the sand, moving along the upstream edge of the bar, close to the water rather than near the tents, the kind of sound that's so clearly footfall in loose sand that I didn't question what I was hearing, just assumed I knew who it was. I lay still for a moment, listening, assuming it was someone who couldn't sleep taking a walk along the water's edge the way people sometimes do on river trips when the night is clear and the canyon walls are bright with moonlight. And then I registered that the sound was wrong in a specific way, too heavy, too deliberate, with a spacing between steps that suggested something considerably larger than any of my guests, who I knew well enough by day 4 of a trip to have a reasonable sense of how they moved. I sat up and looked toward the sound. The moon was up, enough to see the bar clearly for a good distance in either direction, the sand pale and almost luminous in the reflected light, the kind of visibility that makes canyon nights feel more open and legible than they have any right to feel. The beach was empty. Whatever I'd been hearing had stopped the moment I moved, in the way that sounds sometimes do when you've been holding very still and finally shift position, and I spent several minutes scanning the visible stretch of sand without finding any source, checking the water's edge, the driftwood pile-up river, the shadow at the base of the canyon wall where the moonlight didn't reach. I checked with my guests the next morning, casually, asking if anyone had been up walking around during the night. Nobody had. Two of them, unprompted, mentioned that they'd heard footsteps at some point in the night and assumed it had been me or another guest. The detail that stayed with me wasn't the footsteps themselves. It was the sand. That bar held tracks from everything that crossed it. Our own boot prints from the previous evening laid out in a clear record of everyone's movements. Bird tracks near the waterline from a great blue heron I'd watched work the shallows at dusk. The distinctive drag marks of a beaver I'd spotted earlier that evening working a snag upstream. Canyon sand at that moisture level holds an impression from almost anything, down to a tumbleweed rolling through. Whatever had been walking the upstream edge of that bar had left nothing. Not a compression, not a scuff, nothing. I walked that section carefully in the morning light, covering a good 50 yards of undisturbed beach in the area where the sound had clearly been originating based on both my own impression and the independent accounts from my guests, and found exactly the same clean, unmarked surface that you'd expect from a stretch of beach nobody had visited. I mentioned it to another guide, a woman who'd been running that same river section for going on 20 years, the kind of experience that earns real credibility when she says something unusual, someone who'd logged more nights on that canyon sandbars than almost anyone else working the river commercially in that region. She told me, without any prompting about the specifics of what I'd heard or where, that a particular bend in that canyon had a reputation among longtime river guides, something that circulated informally among people who ran that stretch regularly, of unexplained sounds at night on or near certain camps, usually described as footsteps or movement that left no visible sign and stopped before any source could be located, sometimes attributed to wildlife by people who wanted an explanation and sometimes simply left unattributed by people who'd stopped trying to find one. She'd had her own experience on that same stretch years earlier, she said, also involving footsteps she'd attributed initially to a guest, also on a moonlit night when she'd had a clear enough view of the surrounding sand to be confident nobody was actually there, also with nothing found in the morning sand. She'd asked around afterward the same way I had, and found two other guides who described similar nights at camps within a few miles of each other along that same canyon section, over a span of several years, with no contact between any of them prior to comparing notes. She didn't offer a theory. She said river guides, like most people who spend enough time in remote country, eventually develop a practical working relationship with the things they can't explain, which in canyon river country means accepting that certain stretches of river simply carry a reputation without anyone feeling a particular obligation to explain why. I've run that section 3 times since. I've camped on that same bar twice. Nothing unusual has happened on any of those subsequent trips, which is its own kind of answer, I suppose, though not the kind that resolves anything. What I keep thinking about is the sand. Canyon sand is honest in a way that most surfaces aren't. It records everything that touches it, from a beetle's crossing to a heron's landing, with perfect, unhurried clarity. Whatever was moving along that bar had either not touched the sand at all, or touched it in a way that left nothing behind. Both of those possibilities are harder to explain than the sound itself, and both of them, on certain quiet stretches of flat water with canyon walls rising on either side and nobody else for miles in either direction, are harder to set aside than they have any right to be. I've thought about the specific acoustic properties of canyon terrain since, because that's the kind of rational foothold I reach for when I want to give an experience like this a framework that doesn't require anything unusual to explain it. Canyon walls do strange things with sound. A noise made half a mile upriver can arrive at a campsite with a clarity and proximity that makes it seem like it's happening 10 feet away, and conversely, sound that originates very close can sometimes scatter in ways that make it difficult to precisely locate. I've been fooled before by distant rapids sounding like voices, by wind in a side canyon sounding like footsteps on loose rock. These acoustic illusions are real, well-documented features of canyon terrain, and I take them seriously as explanations for borderline experiences. This one doesn't fit that framework comfortably, and the reason it doesn't is the guests. Two of them heard the same footsteps, independently, from different tent positions on opposite sides of the camp, and both located them in the same general direction before anyone compared notes the next morning. A single person can mishear acoustics and construct a false location for a sound. Three people, positioned differently, independently agreeing on both the sound and its approximate location, is considerably harder to explain as a shared acoustic illusion, especially when the thing they agreed on hearing left no mark on a surface that should have captured even the lightest contact. I still guide. I still love that canyon country in a way that hasn't changed at all since that trip. But I notice, now, a specific kind of attention I pay to the edges of a campfire's light on certain bars in that canyon section, watching the line where the lit sand gives way to shadow, listening for a particular weight, and spacing in what comes back from the dark. The ski patrol. I've worked as a backcountry ski patrol for 7 seasons at a resort in the mountains of northern Utah, a job that involves early morning avalanche mitigation work, boundary monitoring, and occasional search and rescue in terrain that, before the lifts open and after they close, belongs entirely to the patrol team. The resort's boundary extends into genuinely backcountry terrain on 2 sides, with patrol routes that take us well into untracked alpine country at hours when no resort guest would ever be out there. Morning patrol starts before first light. You're moving through terrain in the dark, in cold that can be severe, often alone on your assigned route, checking conditions and setting up for the mitigation work that follows. I've done thousands of morning patrol runs over 7 seasons and developed an intimate familiarity with every feature of the terrain I cover, which matters for what I'm about to describe. 3 seasons ago, on a morning in mid-January, I was running my assigned route through a bowl on the eastern boundary, a section of terrain that butts up against genuine wilderness on the far side of a ridgeline. No resort infrastructure beyond the patrol cabin about a mile back. No reason for any guest or employee to be anywhere near it at that hour. The snow conditions that morning were unusual. A rain crust had formed overnight and then refrozen hard in the cold that followed, creating a surface that recorded weight impressively clearly, the kind of consolidated, glassy snow where you could read every ski track, every boot print, every animal crossing from the previous 12 hours with the kind of precision that usually requires a controlled lab environment rather than open alpine terrain. When I crested the ridge into the bowl, I found a single set of tracks crossing the center of it, starting at the far ridgeline and proceeding straight across the bowl's open face toward the trees on my side. Bipedal, evenly spaced. Very large. There was no ski track parallel to them, no equipment drag, no suggestion of any human-powered transport system alongside what I was looking at, just the impressions themselves, one after another, marching across the most open and exposed section of that bowl in a completely straight line. I want to be precise about what I mean by very large, because precision matters in this account. My own boot is a size 11 men's, and I know what my own impression looks like on a hard crust. The impressions I was looking at were easily twice the length and considerably wider, pressed deep into a surface that my own weight barely dented, suggesting considerably more mass than I represent in full avalanche gear and pack. The stride length was exceptional, close to 5 feet between consecutive impressions on average, consistent across the entire visible line of travel, with no variation in depth or spacing that would suggest fatigue, uneven footing, or a human wearing some kind of oversized equipment who would inevitably show variation in their stride under those conditions. I followed the tracks across the bowl to where they entered the trees. They continued into the timber in a consistent line. There was no vehicle, no ski equipment, no indication of any kind of human operation that would explain what I was looking at. Whoever or whatever had made those tracks had crossed that bowl sometime in the previous several hours, covering terrain that has no business seeing any kind of traffic at that hour in that season, leaving prints that don't match any explanation I was able to apply. I photographed everything, flagged the location in my patrol notes as requiring follow-up, and finished my route. I brought 2 other patrol members back to the bowl that afternoon. Both are experienced backcountry professionals who've seen and identified every kind of track this terrain produces. Neither of them had a confident identification. One suggested a large bear walking upright for a distance, which bears do occasionally, but bears don't sustain a fully bipedal stride across open terrain for hundreds of feet without reverting to 4 legs, and the impression was wrong for a bear's hind foot in ways both of them noted independently. One of those 2 patrol members told me, before we skied out, that a member of the patrol team from several seasons before my hire had reported similar unidentified prints in a different section of the same general area, also on a hard-crust morning after weather conditions that would have preserved tracks exceptionally well, also without satisfactory identification. I'd never heard this story before that afternoon, since it predated my time on the team and wasn't the kind of thing that typically gets passed along in formal onboarding. Knowing that it existed, knowing that someone else on the same team, years before me, had documented the same category of unexplained evidence in the same general terrain, changed how I thought about what I'd photographed that morning. I still run that same boundary route most mornings during the season. I check that bowl every time the conditions are right for reading tracks. So far, nothing like it has shown up again. But I know what a hard crust looks like when something very heavy has crossed it. And some mornings, scanning those slopes in the pre-dawn blue, I find myself hoping the bowl is empty. I want to be honest about what kind of professional I'm describing when I say 2 experienced patrol members couldn't make a confident identification. These are people who spend their working lives reading terrain and making precise, consequence-bearing assessments of snow conditions, snowpack stability, and environmental signs. Getting something wrong in this profession has real costs, a missed hazard, a misread track in a rescue context. So we're not people who reach for uncertainty when certainty is available. When 2 patrol professionals with a combined 30-plus years of mountain experience look at a track and decline to put a name to it, that carries real weight. The photographs I took that morning are still on my phone. I've shown them to a handful of people since, including a wildlife biologist friend who specializes in large mammal tracking in the Intermountain West, someone with formal training in exactly the kind of analysis those images require. She looked at them carefully, asked several specific questions about the snow conditions, and told me she couldn't make a confident identification either. She said the closest analog she could find in her reference materials wasn't anything she was comfortable naming as an explanation, and that she'd prefer not to speculate beyond what the physical evidence actually supported. She kept a copy of the photos. I don't know what, if anything, she's done with them since. The fact that she didn't offer a quick, dismissive explanation is the detail I come back to most. She's not someone who entertains loose thinking about wildlife identification. If there was an obvious answer, she would have given it to me. Morning patrol has a specific rhythm to it that shapes how you interact with what you encounter. You're covering ground efficiently, making assessments that feed into life safety decisions later in the day, operating on a schedule tight enough that deviations have downstream costs. When I found those tracks, I had maybe 10 minutes to document them carefully before I needed to keep moving. I used those 10 minutes as well as I could, taking photographs from multiple angles and distances, making a sketch in my notebook of the general stride pattern and proportions relative to my own reference points, noting the time and the snow conditions in enough detail that anyone reviewing the documentation afterward could form their own assessment of what I'd actually observed. That documentation exists. It's not comprehensive, because 10 minutes isn't enough to do comprehensive field documentation of something like that, but it's what I had, and what I have, and the wildlife biologist who reviewed the photographs saw the same thing in them that I saw in the actual snow that morning. I've thought about whether there are reasonable explanations I haven't considered. Snowshoes produce a distinctive, elongated impression and are the most common candidate explanation people reach for. I've laid my own snowshoes flat in comparable snow and compared the impression to my photographs. The differences are substantial. Snowshoe impressions have a uniform depth across the whole impression area, no arch, no visible toe differentiation, a flat and characteristically rectangular shape. What I documented that morning had depth variation consistent with a foot that flexes and distinct toe impressions at the front of each stride. These are not snowshoes. I don't know what they are. The trail crew. I've worked on Forest Service trail crews for 9 seasons, mostly in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies, doing the kind of manual labor that keeps backcountry trail systems passable, clearing blowdown, rebuilding tread, replacing drainage structures, working sections of trail that sometimes haven't seen another person since the previous crew came through. It's slow, methodical, solitary work for stretches of the day, and it puts you in contact with terrain most people never reach, the kind of places where you work an entire week without seeing a single hiker. 6 seasons ago, I was crewing a remote section in the Cascades, working a trail that climbed through old-growth forest for several miles before opening onto a high alpine plateau. The old-growth section was the kind of cathedral timber that makes you involuntarily quiet when you enter it, Douglas fir and western red cedar that had been growing there for centuries, the canopy so high and dense that the light had a greenish, filtered quality even at midday. We were working in 2-person teams that week, with my partner Kevin and I clearing a section about 4 miles from the trailhead. On our 3rd day working that section, Kevin, who was maybe 50 yards up trail from me clearing a large blowdown, suddenly stopped working and went very still. I noticed because the sound of his chainsaw cut off in a way that wasn't a planned stop, and then he didn't move for long enough that I put down my own tools and walked toward him. He was standing at the edge of the blowdown, looking back down the trail we'd come up that morning. I asked what was wrong. He said he'd seen someone standing between 2 large firs about 30 yards down trail, watching him. A person, standing still, looking directly at him. By the time I'd walked up to him, whatever he'd seen was gone. We both walked back down to that section of trail and checked. We found nothing, not a boot print, not a scuff, nothing to suggest anyone had been standing in the spot he indicated, which was soft duff between 2 enormous root systems, the kind of surface that shows impressions readily. The trail itself behind that point was clear for several hundred yards, good sightline back, toward the trailhead, nobody on it. Kevin is the most phlegmatic person I've worked with in 9 seasons of trail crew. He isn't someone who invents things or reaches for drama when plain description will do. He described what he'd seen in a careful, almost clinical way over lunch, sitting on a log and eating his sandwich like it was a debrief rather than a ghost story, noting the approximate height of the figure, its stillness, the fact that it had been fully upright, and clearly not an animal based on both proportion and posture, and the fact that it had stopped being there without moving in the same confounding non-explanation that I would eventually use to describe 2 of my own experiences on different trails in subsequent seasons. He didn't ask me to believe him. He simply reported what he'd observed, the way you'd report anything else you noticed while working, and then went back to work. The following year, on a different crew in a different district, one of my new partners mentioned, completely unprompted, that he'd seen what he could only describe as a watcher on an isolated stretch of trail in the Olympics the previous season, a figure standing in the timber observing him work, gone before he reached it. He offered it as an odd story from a long season, not particularly distressed by the telling, just noting it as something that had happened and remained unaccounted for. I told him Kevin's story without leading with any specific detail first. He said the most specific thing Kevin had mentioned, the total stillness, the absence of any movement in the departure, was exactly how he would have described his own, that the thing he kept trying to explain to people was that it didn't leave the way anything leaves. That's the detail that gets me when I let myself think about it seriously. Not the figures themselves, which could theoretically be explained away as misidentified wildlife or stumps and shadows playing tricks on eyes that have been staring at green and brown for hours. It's the departure. Things leave. Animals run, or walk away, or melt into brush in a way you can follow even if you can't see the whole movement. These didn't do any of that. They were simply no longer there, as if the space they'd been occupying had closed up behind them without a seam. I'm still on cruise. I still work sections of old growth that have that quality of being watched in, the sense that the trees are old enough to have opinions. I've come to treat that feeling as simply a feature of certain kinds of forest, something you acknowledge and move through rather than something you stop to examine. The work is the same regardless. The trail still needs clearing. You put your head down and keep working, and you try not to make too much of the moments when you look up and have to convince yourself the gap between those 2 big trees has always been empty. I want to describe the old growth section more carefully because the environment itself is relevant to how seriously I take what Kevin reported. That forest hadn't been logged and had no history of significant human disturbance going back centuries. The nearest road was 4 miles away by trail, and the trail register at the trailhead showed we were the only people who'd signed in for that drainage in the previous 2 weeks. Whoever or whatever Kevin saw between those firs had gotten there without using the trail, or had been there without using the trail, which in terrain that's steep and that densely vegetated is a significant observation on its own. The area off-trail from that section is essentially impenetrable for any large mammal that travels the way humans do, upright, on 2 feet, in open forest clearings. To stand where Kevin indicated watching him would require having crossed serious terrain without a trail, and to disappear from that spot without any sign of movement would require doing it again instantly. I've asked other trail crew workers about this kind of experience since, more directly than I would have before Kevin's account gave me a reason to be specific. In 9 seasons across maybe a dozen different crews, I've gotten 7 accounts of some version of the same thing. A figure observed briefly at the edge of working visibility in remote terrain, gone before approach, nothing found. The accounts come from people I trust and respect professionally, people who spend their working lives applying careful observation to physical terrain and who have no particular stake in making themselves sound credible at the expense of accuracy. 7 accounts is not a statistical sample. It's more than coincidence. On the 2 occasions when I experienced it myself, in subsequent seasons on different trails in different districts, what I noticed beyond the figure itself was the silence that preceded it. Not a total silence, since the forest never goes entirely quiet, but a quality of reduced activity that I've since come to recognize as what the forest sounds like when something large is moving through it that the other animals have already registered and adjusted to. Both times I noticed the figure, I'd already been walking in a section where the ordinary bird activity felt slightly muted, the small movements in the underbrush slightly less frequent. I don't know if I noticed the quiet because something was there, or whether I was primed to notice it by what I'd experienced with Kevin. But both times, the quiet preceded the visual by several minutes, and both times, once the figure was gone, the normal ambient activity resumed relatively quickly, the way it does when a threat has passed rather than when it's simply gone elsewhere. I've asked myself many times whether 9 seasons of trail crew work has simply given me a richer vocabulary for forest observation and therefore a greater capacity to notice things I would previously have missed, or whether the things I'm now noticing represent something that was always there and is simply becoming more legible to me over time. I don't have an answer to that question. What I have is the specific memory of Kevin's face when I walked up to him that morning, calm but changed, the expression of someone who has seen something that will require some revising. The vet call. I've worked as a large animal veterinarian in rural Montana for 16 years, covering a practice territory that spans close to 3,000 square miles, doing farm and ranch calls that sometimes take me down remote 2-tracks in the middle of the night, while off any maintained road, to reach livestock on properties that sit an hour or more from the nearest town. Night calls are part of the job. You get used to driving alone in the dark on unfamiliar roads through country you only sort of know, finding ranches by landmarks rather than addresses. This was 6 years ago, a night call to a cattle ranch on the far western edge of my territory, a calving emergency that had come in close to midnight. The access road to that ranch was about 7 miles long, crossing a section of Bureau of Land Management ground before reaching the private land, a gravel track with no lighting of any kind, just my headlights on sage and wire fence. About 4 miles in, I came around a gradual bend and my headlights lit up something on the road ahead, maybe 100 feet out. It was standing in the road, center of the lane, facing me. It was tall, very tall, and it was on 2 legs. My first reading was a person, and I slowed immediately, the reflex you develop for anything in the road at night, and then almost as immediately revised that reading as I covered more ground and got a clearer look. The proportions were wrong. The head seemed smaller relative to the body than a person's head looks at that distance in headlights. The legs were long in a way I couldn't immediately specify, but that registered as not right before any deliberate analysis, and the overall silhouette had a narrowness to it that didn't match how a person looks when lit from the front in the kind of posture you'd assume standing still in a road at night. It stood in my headlight beam for what couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 seconds before stepping off the road to the right, into the sage, with a single stride that covered ground in a way that made it disappear from my headlights faster than the distance should have allowed, the kind of speed-to-distance ratio that stays wrong no matter how many times I work it out in my head. I sat there for a moment with the truck stopped and engine running, looking at where it had been standing and at the sage it had stepped into, which was not tall enough to conceal anything of that height from that angle at that distance. And then I drove on because there was a calving emergency and a rancher waiting, and getting that done was the priority regardless of everything else. I've thought a great deal, since, about whether what I saw could have been a very tall person, possibly a ranch hand from a neighboring property walking along the access road for some reason. The height argues against it. I've been doing this job for 16 years, and I've developed a reliable calibration for height and distance in headlight illumination, and whatever I saw was not person height. The stride argues against it too, and the fact that it stepped into sage that, once it cleared my headlights, should still have been visible as a shape in my peripheral light for several seconds, but wasn't. I mentioned it to the rancher while I was working on his cow, not because it seemed like relevant veterinary conversation, but because I was still rattled enough that it came out anyway. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished he told me that that particular stretch of BLM road had a local reputation in the ranching community of the area, something several neighbors had mentioned to him over the years, of a tall figure seen along the road at night, always briefly, always near the same general section. He said he'd never experienced it personally, but had heard enough versions from people he trusted to have started using the paved county road when he had to drive that way after dark, which added 40 minutes to the round trip. He said it with the same tone he used for everything else, matter of fact, the way a person who works with large animals in isolated country treats most things that can't be easily fixed or explained. You note it. You adjust your route if you can. You keep working. I've used the county road on that call ever since. The ranch changed ownership 2 years ago, and I rarely go out that direction anymore. But on the occasions when I've had to pass through that general area at night, I use the long way around without much conscious deliberation. Some adjustments become habit before you finish deciding to make them. I want to describe what the job does to your perception over time, because it's relevant context. Large animal practice takes you into situations that require rapid, accurate assessment under stress, in poor light, often when you're already fatigued from a long day before the night call started. You learn to trust your immediate reading of a situation because there are real consequences to getting it wrong. An agitated 1,200-pound cow in a dark barn is not a context in which you want to discover that your perception is unreliable. After 16 years, I have real confidence in my ability to assess what I'm looking at in a headlight beam at 100 feet. I've identified coyotes, elk, moose, deer, cattle, horses, pronghorn, and the occasional black bear at various distances and light conditions, and I've been wrong enough times to develop honest calibration around my own accuracy. What I saw that night on the BLM road didn't fall into any category I had a name for. That's not something I say loosely. The rancher's confirmation of a local reputation mattered to me more than it might have otherwise precisely because of where he heard it. Ranch communities in that part of Montana are small, interconnected, and deeply skeptical of dramatic claims. Ranchers who work isolated country have seen enough genuinely strange wildlife behavior, enough unexplained livestock incidents, enough ordinary nighttime tricks of light and distance that they don't typically add to a reputation for something they haven't seen themselves without good reason. If several neighbors had mentioned that stretch of road to him over the years, they'd thought the mention was warranted. That's not nothing out there. I've been on that access road dozens of times since, at all hours, in all seasons, before and after that particular night. I've never seen anything unusual on it again, which is the kind of fact that seems like it should be reassuring and somehow isn't. Whatever was in that road that night was there once, and the combination of how clearly I saw it, how wrong its proportions were, and how completely it disappeared into cover that shouldn't have concealed it is a combination that doesn't resolve into anything comfortable regardless of how long since it happened. I think about the rancher's response sometimes, specifically the practical, untroubled way he offered the information about the road's reputation. He didn't seem concerned for my safety after the fact, didn't suggest I'd had a near miss or ought to take precautions. He spoke about it the way he might have mentioned that a particular gate is tricky to open in cold weather. Useful local knowledge, worth sharing, not a source of ongoing anxiety for someone who lives and works in that country year-round. I think that tone is the right one. Not dismissive, not dramatic. Just honest acknowledgement that some things in remote country don't have easy explanations, and that the appropriate response is to adjust where you can and keep working where you have to. There's a practical aspect to working large animal emergency medicine in remote country that shapes how you process experiences like this one, which is that the job never pauses to let you absorb something unusual. I saw what I saw. I processed it in about 30 seconds while sitting in an idling truck on a dark BLM road, and then I drove the remaining 3 miles to a ranch where there was a cow in distress and a rancher who needed help. By the time I delivered that calf, cleaned up my equipment, and exchanged a few words with the rancher about what I'd seen, close to 2 hours had passed, and the experience had already taken on the slightly flattened quality that strange experiences acquire when you've had to set them aside and do something else. That flattening isn't the same as diminishment. The memory is just as specific now as it was sitting in the truck. It's simply that 16 years of night calls have taught me to keep the strangeness in a separate compartment from the work itself, and those compartments don't always mix cleanly afterward.